my name is Alan Robertson. I'm the BMA Scotland lead on pensions. I'm also an employee member of the NHS Scotland Scheme Advisory Board and a past chair of the BMA UK Pensions Committee. However, I'm not a financial advisor. These slides are provided purely for information. This is an incredibly complicated area of taxation. It varies greatly by individual, and we would always recommend seeking personal financial advice from an advisor with specialist knowledge of the NHS pension scheme. We've prepared two presentations for you in order to help understand taxation and the NHS pension scheme. In the first presentation, I explain the nuts and bolts of the scheme, how the different sections work, and discuss some additional features such as ill health retirement. For this second presentation, the focus is squarely on pensions taxation, how it is calculated, how it will affect you, and what the BMA is doing on behalf of members to help address the problem. Over recent years, doctors have been hit with large and often very unexpected tax bills. These bills frequently run into 5 and occasionally even up to 6 figures. They relate primarily to the complex interplay of HMRC rules and the NHS pension scheme, leading to a breach in the annual allowance for pension growth. It's clear that doctors are becoming increasingly aware of this issue. In a recent BMA survey in England, over half of consultants stated they plan to retire at or before 60, with over half citing the pensions taxation as the reason for this. Clearly, this lost workforce capacity will exacerbate the already critical shortages that are seen across the NHS. Lost capacity will also increase the spending on outsourcing and locum costs to maintain frontline services. Pensions taxation is the single biggest issue affecting consultants and GPs at present, and indeed the BMA Pensions Department has seen a doubling of inquiries over the last few months. We're working on a calculator to help estimate your liabilities. However, in this presentation, the focus is on understanding the underlying basis of the calculations. Let's start with the simpler of the two taxes, lifetime allowance. This was originally introduced in 2011 at a level of £1.8 million. It's fallen over the years and now sits at just over 1 million. To calculate the sum, you need to take the annual pension, multiply it by 20 and then add on any lump sum. If the pension benefits exceed the lifetime allowance, then a tax charge will be levied at a rate of 25% if applied to the pension. The tax charge is generally assessed at the time of receiving pension benefits, so has less impact from year to year. Here's a worked example based around the 1995 section for ease of calculation. We have an annual pension of £55,000 and a lump sum of 3 times that. This gives us a capital value of just under £1.3 million. Compared to the LTA, this means there's an excess of £210,000, giving a tax charge of £52,500. Using the same actuarial factor of 20, this works out a reduction of pension of £2,625, giving a new annual pension of £52,375. Now, things get a bit more complicated with the annual allowance. This was also brought in back in 2011 at a level of £255,000. It too has fallen over time and currently sits at £40,000. With tapering, this can fall further right down to £10,000. We'll come back later to that in more detail. The key concept with annual allowance is to look at the deemed pension growth at the beginning and the end of the pension input period. To provide a fair comparison, the benefits at the start of the period are increased by inflation to reflect their real-term value at the end of the period. It's the difference of these two figures that gives us the growth in pension and lump sum. Any salary-based components are multiplied by a valuation factor of 16. If you have an unused annual allowance from the previous 3 tax years, this can be carried forward. If you end up with a tax charge of over £2,000, then there is an option to use scheme pays to deal with the bill, and we'll come back to this later too. So let's look through a real-world example. We have a consultant, age 44. They were a member of the 1995 section until April 2015, had no protection, and started the NHS when they were 23. I've assumed CPI is stable at 2%. At the beginning of the pension input period, they had a salary of £88,105. By the end, this had gone up to £93,928, which is the next increment on the consultant pay scale. So, we start by working out the pension benefits at the beginning. First, let's look at their 1995 section service. They've accrued 19 years in this section, from when they started aged 23 to when the 2015 section came in aged 42. So, we need to take 19/80ths and multiply by the salary at the start. 2% CPI is then added along with the lump sum. For the 2015 section, things are a little more complicated. You'll remember from the previous presentation that each year of care pension is revalued by 1/54th plus CPI, so we need to apply this to their accrued 2015 pension to date. Now we turn to the benefits at the end of the period. They've not got an added years contract in place, so they haven't accrued any more years of service. Their pay has gone up though, so both salary and lump sum increase. For the 2015 section, we again need to uprate their previously accrued care pension and add in the £1,800 they've gained from this year. We're now in a position to work out the deemed pension growth. The final salary growth is multiplied by 16, then added to the lump sum. As you can see, we've gone over the £40,000 limit, so a tax charge is liable on the 7,967 above that limit. Annual allowance excess is charged at the taxpayer's marginal rate, so at 41% this would be 3,266. Given their pay rise was 5,823, this means they've actually had an effective tax rate of 55% on this additional income. The doctor may choose to pay that bill in one go via their tax return. However, particularly with larger sums, they may need to use a system called scheme pays. This is effectively a loan against the final pension and means the scheme takes care of the bill for you. A conversion factor is applied to the bill, and this debt then grows with CPI each year. As you can imagine, this can make it a very expensive option in some cases. There are two small silver linings though. One, it is deducted from the final pension before the lifetime allowance is calculated, so it can reduce that liability. The second, slightly more morbid one, is that the debt is wiped if the member dies in service. Let's walk through an example. A 40-year-old member with a £2,000 annual allowance tax bill with a normal pension age of 67, but intending to retire at 60. Again, we assume CPI of 2%. There is a table available on the SPPA website that gives scheme pays factors. At age 40, this is 9.3. We therefore divide the tax bill by this factor to give a reduction in pension of just over £215. We need to compound CPI from age 40 to 60 and add it to the deduction. This gives us a bill of almost £320. They're wanting to retire early though, so we need to apply an early retirement factor, 31% in this case, to give a revised gross deduction from their pension of £220.50. So now we know how it's calculated. Why is the annual allowance a particular problem for doctors? As mentioned in the previous presentation, most non-public sector schemes are so-called defined contribution schemes. This means you decide on a yearly basis how much money you wish to put in your pension. Therefore, it's relatively easy for high earners in the non-public sector to calculate what their annual allowance is and only invest up to that amount. However, in these schemes, the final pension value is not known. The NHS pension scheme is a defined benefit scheme. This means you do know what pension you'll receive at retirement. However, in the NHS, you have almost no control over how much you pay into the scheme, as the amount is based on a percentage of your pensionable pay. Furthermore, pensionable pay rises are also often out with the control of the employee, as they are determined according to nationally agreed pay scales. As we've just seen, any in-year increase in pension growth in a defined benefit scheme is multiplied by a factor between 16 and 19 to determine the overall pension growth. Consequently, relatively small increases in pensionable pay can generate very large deemed pension growth. A further important issue that is relatively unique to the NHS is the way in which the annual allowance is calculated and applied to members who have membership of Legacy Final Salary Pension Scheme and are in the new care scheme. These members are hit especially hard with significant tax bills throughout their working career. There's one final piece of the jigsaw of how doctors are badly hit by pension tax rules: annual allowance tapering. This one is a more recent invention, introduced in 2016. There are two key numbers to be aware of. The first is threshold income. This is your total income from all sources minus any contributions that have relief deducted at source. Your pension contributions, for example, would be deducted from this. You need to be careful around salary sacrifice schemes. In the past, these would have been deducted, but any arrangements set up after July 2015 are now added back in to calculate threshold income. The second important level is the adjusted income. As mentioned before, it's vital to understand this is not the same as your earnings. It's your total income, including any pension growth. It's very easy for doctors with an income of around £100,000 or even below to have an adjusted income of over £150,000, and hence they need to be especially careful if their income rises above the threshold income, as the effects of tapering can be particularly severe. So, as long as you don't breach the £110,000 threshold, then tapering does not apply, even if you would in theory have a large adjusted income, although you will still have an annual allowance tax charge to pay if you exceed your non-taper limit. If you do breach both thresholds, then for every £2 your adjusted income is above £150,000, your annual allowance reduces by £1. Remember that any pension growth above your annual allowance is taxed at the applicable marginal rate. Let's take an example. We have Dr. A. She works solely in the NHS and is aged 40. She had a pensionable pay rise in the 2018-19 tax year, more than previous years, as she reached an increment on the pay scale whilst also being successful in her discretionary points application. This means her deemed pension growth across the two sections is £80,000. Her threshold income is forecast to be £109,000, and she has no annual allowance carry forward available from her last 3 years. We don't need to worry about calculating her adjusted income, as her taxable income is below that magic £110,000 number. However, despite being under that number, she still has an AA tax charge to pay. Her pension growth is £40,000 above her annual allowance limit. We add this to her £109,000 taxable income, but she remains under the £150,000 level for top rate tax, and therefore will pay based on her usual marginal rate of 41%. This means a bill of £16,400. Assuming she isn't able to pay this herself, she may need to use scheme pays, a likely bill at retirement of just under £39,000. Okay, so that's bad, but what if she'd done a bit of extra work that year? Unfortunately, Dr. A is working in a shortage specialty. She works every 6th weekend, is on call every 6th midweek night. Her colleague's been off sick though, and she's agreed to cover some extra on-call weekends when she would otherwise have been off, and she did this for an additional £2,000. Now this extra pay is not pensionable, however it still counts towards her threshold income. This means she's gone £1,000 over the £110,000 limit, and we need to look at her adjusted income. This consists of the £111,000 of taxable income plus the deemed pension growth of £80,000, giving a total of £191,000. This small amount of non-pensionable additional income has therefore made her subject to tapering. Her annual allowance is reduced by £1 for every £2 above £150,000, bringing it down to £19,500. Her annual allowance excess is therefore now £60,500. To calculate her marginal tax rate for the annual allowance tax charge, we need to add this excess to her taxable income, giving us a total of £171,500. So £21,500 of the growth is now subject to the top rate 46% tax, even though she's nominally only a higher rate 41% taxpayer. So her tax charge is almost £10,000 on the top rate annual allowance excess, then 41% on the rest, giving a total tax charge of £25,880. This would equate to a scheme pays cost of over £60,000. This means that for undertaking £2,000 of extra non-pensionable work to help out her short-staff service, Dr. A has incurred an additional £9,480 of tax. This is a marginal rate of 474%. This slide shows the calculations side by side for the two scenarios. You can see her take-home pay has reduced from £41,560 to £33,260 due to undertaking this additional work. Well, if we're saying working more can lead to bigger tax bills, what happens if you reduce your sessions? The blue line shows an example annual allowance tax bill for a consultant working 12 sessions who received an award of 3 discretionary points in their late 30s and with non-pensionable income from waiting list initiatives, extra income of approximately £25,000. You can see the spikes every 5 years when a pay increment is received. However, if those 2 EPA sessions are dropped, there's a reduction, as shown in the red line. If further sessions are dropped, down to 9 in yellow, 8 in green, or 7 in orange, the AA tax bill progressively drops. Assuming they use scheme pays to deal with their AA tax bills, the cumulative effects of this are significant. state pension age stopping the EPAs reduces the scheme pays loan by almost £250,000. This has a very interesting knock-on effect on the pension then received. One would expect that doing less pensionable work would lead to a lower pension. However, due to the disproportionate effects of the taper, it can paradoxically lead to an increase in pension. This graph shows that the optimum level of pay for this consultant is at around the 7 to 8 PA mark. Clearly, with SPA requirements remaining similar, this is going to have a disproportionate impact on DCC activity. Apart from junior doctors in their first few years of training, the majority of medical staff will now be members of two sections of the NHS pension scheme. The annual allowance is calculated separately for the 1995-2008 sections and the 2015 section. The final salary schemes are closed to further accruals. This means that, unless you have an added years contract, you cannot increase the number of years of service, and this remains fixed at the level it had reached in April 2015. Your pension is allowed to increase in line with CPI without this being considered growth. However, if you're not accruing additional years, the only way this can happen is if your pensionable pay increases at least in line with CPI. This means that in the many years of sub-inflationary pay growth we've had recently, the pension growth on the 1995 section in particular may well be negative. However, for the purposes of the annual allowance calculation, negative pension growth is considered zero, and this negative growth is not offset against the positive growth in the 2015 scheme. Another issue is that as a result of the revaluation that is part of care, the 2015 scheme generates a constant and increasing level of pension growth, which results in recurrent and increasing annual allowance tax bills. By contrast, in the 1995 scheme, in years without an incremental pay rise, not all available annual allowance is used, and this allows build-up of carry forward. This graph shows the effect that being a member of two schemes has for a doctor. It's based on a 40-year-old consultant on 12 PAs with 4 discretionary points, 5% on-call supplement, 14 years accrued in the 95 section, and £25,000 of additional income. The black triangles show the cumulative scheme pays loan that's generated whilst being a member of two schemes. The black crosses show the scheme pays loan that would be generated if the consultant was able to remain solely in the 1995 scheme. The red triangles and crosses show the cumulative tax charges if, rather than using scheme pays, they opted to pay the tax from their net income. The differences are striking. Despite the 1995 scheme being a far more generous pension scheme with a higher final pension, the scheme pays loan generated by being a member of both 95 and 2015 schemes is almost 10 times higher at £1 million compared to just over £100,000 if the member had remained solely in the 1995 scheme. These are clearly big bills. With the current NHS pension scheme, there's no control over the value paid in. You're either in it or out of it. You also don't have control over pay progression, as it's nationally determined. Although it's an option for some, many will be too young to retire. Options, therefore, include either opting out of the scheme entirely or doing so for only part of the year, also known as doing the hokey cokey. As you may recall from the first presentation, there are some ancillary benefits to the scheme, especially around death and service, which reduce, depending on how long you've been out of it. This is something to bear in mind. Reducing non-pensionable pay to come back under the £110,000 taxable income level can help with tapering. For NHS work, it may be the case that working part-time is an option. When considering discretionary point applications, it's important to look at other income changes that year, especially increments. If considering taking on extra work, then time off in lieu is often preferable to extra pay. However, this is not always easy if it's due to workforce shortages. It's also important to point out that it's your responsibility as a taxpayer to calculate your potential liability for annual allowance. The SPPA will notify you if you breach individually in either the 9508 or the 2015 scheme, but that will be based on the standard AA limits. They have no knowledge of your non-NHS income and whether you may be subject to tapering. As you can see from the examples we've considered, senior NHS staff are now regularly receiving large tax bills due to exceeding their annual allowance. This has an understandable knock-on effect, with significant reductions in sessional activity or retirement being considered. This exacerbates an already critically low level of capacity, further increasing NHS costs and external agencies, so clearly is something that should be of interest to employers too. Pensions tax is the biggest single issue currently affecting consultants, SAS doctors and GPs. So what is the BMA doing about this issue? We've been extensively lobbying governments of all 4 nations to change the rules around pension taxation, in particular around the tapered annual allowance. It's a complex area with many components reserved to Westminster, but others, such as recycling employer contributions, are within Scottish control. We've made a strong submission to the Doctors and Dentists Review Body regarding the issues with pensions taxation and await their response to this. We've written directly to the Chancellor and the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport to call for reform of pensions taxation, and in particular for an urgent scrapping of the tapered annual allowance. We've met with NHS employers to warn them of the impending workforce crisis unless urgent action is taken. We've lobbied MPs and MSPs, drafted template letters to assist members in contacting their MPs about this issue. This was extremely successful and evident in the discussions at both parliamentary debate and Prime Minister's question time on the issue. There's also been extensive and overall very positive coverage in the Financial Times, the Herald and on BBC Radio 4's Money Box. The BMA has also launched legal proceedings regarding the potential age discriminatory nature of aspects of the 2015 scheme. We're investing heavily in a modelling tool to help BMA members estimate their tax liabilities and model different scenarios. What immediate mitigations are the BMA asking for? We've suggested an urgent national policy on the recycling of employers' contributions to those who are forced to opt out of the NHS pension scheme as a result of these punitive taxes. This will mitigate against the loss of reward of being forced out of the scheme and help prevent people choosing to retire instead. We've also suggested there needs to be a national policy to offer death in service and ill health retirement benefits to those who need to opt out of the scheme. We've suggested that the BMA, NHS boards and the Scottish Government jointly lobby Treasury for fundamental pension taxation reforms to prevent a workforce crisis in the NHS. In particular, these changes should include scrapping of the tapered annual allowance and a review of how the annual allowance is calculated, particularly for those who are members of more than one NHS pension scheme. However, while these mitigations will offer temporary stability, the long-term solutions lie with the Treasury, and we'll continue to lobby them to secure meaningful pension reform. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this presentation useful. There's plenty more of information available on the BMA website. I'd also like to thank Dr. Vishal Sharma, co-chair of the UK Consultants Negotiations Committee, and Dr. Tony Goldstone, the BMA's National Clinician Advisor on Pay and Pensions, for their help both with developing these slides and raising these issues more widely in the media.